And welcome back. Global Zero is an international campaign that's aiming to eliminate nuclear weapons and advocating for their complete abolition. They strive to gain influence and achieve a world free of nuclear weapons through a combination of inclusive grassroots organizing, influential intellectual leadership, genuine collaborations, compelling narratives, and inventive policy changes. Join me now. We've got the partner for mobilization at Global Zero, Mary Faines, and good to have you, Marie.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talk to me a little bit about this, because when we look at where we are right now, we know, we're talking about the war in Ukraine. We've got Russia, we've got Ukraine, we've got North Korea right there. But then we're talking about the abolition of nuclear weapons. Somebody would say, huge uphill battle. How do you assess where we are right now when it comes to nuclear weapons?
No, you hit the nail on the head there. Unprecedented moment is exactly how I've been phrasing it when we've been having these conversations. Putin's posturing in Ukraine about the potential threat of the use of nuclear weapons has really brought weaponry back into the public zeitgeist. But if I'm going to be honest with you, nuclear weapons have always been playing in the background, especially for Black and brown communities. They are disproportionately impacted by the nuclear weapons complex. And so really what we're trying to do at Global Zero is shed light on the ways that the nuclear weapons complex is impacting people, and then have a conversation about what are authentic ways that we can actually make our world safer and more secure. Because right now we're setting a precedent saying that these weapons are the only way that our country and people can be safe and secure. But I would have to ask you, do you feel safer in this moment after all the things that we just talked about, just because we have these weapons? And often people say the answer is no. They're looking for community safety. They're looking for investment. They're looking for better opportunities for themselves and for their communities. And that's really what we're trying to talk about, is what does a new security structure look like, where we are not pigeonholed simply by the use of militarism as the only way to keep us safe.
Help me understand this, because you said this earlier, and I can make the correlation, but everybody else cannot necessarily. When we talk about nuclear weapons and how it disproportionately impacts communities of color, Black and brown people, somebody on the outside says, well, how? I don't see that, right? But
No, I
can
completely
you make the
understand that.
correlation for somebody?
Yeah, of course. And I've heard that before. I think when you think about proximate issues, particularly for Black and brown communities, it feels disparate to say things like racial justice or public health or climate impact or economic and housing crises intersect with the nuclear weapons complex. But how often do you hear constituents say things like, we need money for our schools, we need money for our housing, we need money for public infrastructure? That money exists. It's hidden in a bloated nuclear weapons budget, right? That is where that money is happening. When you look at who's been disproportionately impacted by things like uranium mining and nuclear testing, that is Black, brown, and indigenous communities, whether we're looking at places in the southwest of the country or we take it all the way to the continent of Africa. Those are the people that are continually disproportionately impacted. When we look at our friends in places like the Marshall Islands, who now have an absolutely huge diaspora here in the United States, they have generational health and climate impacts because of nuclear testing. I hearken back to the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King, Bayard Rustin, those folks fought for a world free of nuclear weapons. I always think about the Martin Luther King quote where he talks about it would be absolutely absurd to integrate lunch counters and not think about a world for us to come back to. They were thinking about where this work intersects with our civil rights. And that is some of the work that we're trying to do now, bring back that holistic understanding of these seemingly disparate issues.
Right. And you talk about the work that you're doing. I mean, part of it is really developing policy, speaking to policy, making policy known, because a lot of us aren't fully aware of the policy when it comes to, we know the big picture. We know the nuclear weapons exist, right? But then sometimes many people are not so aware of the fact that there are some real policy initiatives that are in play, other than just the United States forcing its hand, but some real world and global partnerization to really deal with this.
Yeah. Policy is multilateral when it comes to nuclear weapons. It is not just what we're doing within our government. It is what we are doing across the globe. For us, when we're calling for policy, we're really hearkening for the U.S. to go back to arms control. The U.S. has always been at the forefront of arms control. And with Russia doing things like pulling out of the New START treaty, I don't know how many people functionally understand that, but that was really the last treaty standing in place for arms control and nonproliferation. And so we're calling to continue doing things like verification so we know how many nuclear weapons are out there. We're asking for nuclear powers to come to the table and have conversations about what does it look like to disarm. Then there are larger conversations about nuclear weapons in the global policy structure writ large, right? You're thinking about safety and security for countries across the globe, not just the ones who hold these weapons. And so you have to really think about what does these security structures look like in the context of things like NATO, in the context of the U.S. government, and have a holistic understanding. And we're hoping that by having these conversations in public fora and really bringing it down to a grassroots level so that people understand this is more than just the weapons. There's a human impact. There are people making choices, and there are people that need to understand what is happening to people when they make these choices. And we're hoping that the more that we bring that to the forefront, the more that we bring that to light about the complex holistically, then we can have different conversations about safety and security in our own communities.
Mari, we're talking about right now nearly 3,000 nuclear weapons across the world, and there's a vision that you have, and the vision is really for yourself and partners, really to abolish nuclear weapons by the year 2045. Now, somebody's going to say it's not realistic, but I'm going to ask you, how realistic is that to possibly have no nuclear weapons by 2045?
We've heard it all. We've heard it is the pipe dream, right? That is the bill of goods we've had people say to us a couple of times. And what I would say to you is we have a plan. We have an action plan. I encourage people to go read it. It talks about getting nuclear armed states to the table, having dialogue, trying to figure out what does it actually take to get to that 2045 number. We understand that there is a lot to get there. And with the current security structure, there are a lot of factors at play geopolitically. But it can be done. Somebody once said during the Cold War, we couldn't bring our numbers down, but we did. We started at a point and we've come down from there. There's nothing that says we cannot continue to push ourselves through strong strategic action to get to that zero and still create an equitable and just security structure that is beyond this bomb.
So when you talk about people like Putin, Russian President Vladimir Putin, and then you've got also Kim Jong-un, two not so easy guys to get to the table. What's the best way that we're talking about bringing them to the table? Is it really the invitation to come to the table, have a conversation, or is it more that we're gonna bring some sanctions, we're gonna put some policy in place that is really going to, handcuff you and disarm you?
Honestly, it's going to be a combination of these things, if I'm going to be frank with you, right? You have to come with a multiplicity of options. Treaties and arms control is obviously a way forward, and we think that that's a very strong way forward. Diplomacy and public fora is also another way forward. Track 1.5, there's a myriad of ways that you can get people to the table, and I recognize that some of what diplomacy is tough personality battling and mending and engaging. And it doesn't necessarily always have to start at the top. These are full-scale governments. We have different pieces in play and different levers we can play. And so I'm not going to sit here as a government official and say I have the exact absolute answer about how do you get Putin or Kim Jong-un on the phone. But I do know that we have incredibly smart people in places like our State Department who are working to get these folks to the table, to have policy in place, to get treaties set. And we really need to make sure that at a congressional level, at a senatorial level, and honestly at a constituency level, we are backing the ability for this administration to create a playing field where these types of conversations and diplomatic avenues are options.
Talk to me about Global Zero for a minute and the work that you're doing in terms of, reducing nuclear arms. That's huge. That's policy. But for somebody on the outside looking in who wants to know more, take us inside the doors.
Global Zero is an absolutely wonderful organization, and I think what makes us interesting is we are not thinking about nuclear weapons as a silo. We don't think that the nuclear weapons issue is simply an issue of national security or foreign policy. We are looking at the complex writ large. We're looking at the human side of security. Where does nuclear weapons intersect with things like climate change? Where does it intersect with things like racial justice or public health? And we are thinking about how those other movements for progress, for justice, for equity, how we can all work together to build this world of possibility that behooves and benefits us all, including the most marginalized populations. So on a day-to-day, that looks like conversations with policymakers about what do things like resolutions look like, or how do you talk to constituents about this issue? Because as you've said, for so many people, this is a new issue. So what does it look like to scale it down to the base level for people to understand what to do? We talk to our grassroots activists, our young people. How do you get engaged in this issue? You know, we do things like petitions. We currently have a petition on called the Intersectional Demand Signal, where we've brought together racial justice groups, climate, public health, democracy, faith-based, and we talked about what is the role of getting rid of nuclear weapons and how do we make our issues intersect so that we can find this just and prosperous world that we're working towards. We build coalitions with other groups who are working towards arms control and nonproliferation. And really, what we're trying to do is create a new level of safety and security where people genuinely feel like they are actually safe. And it's not coming from these weapons, it's coming from themselves.
So I got this question for you, right? Most people, when they get engaged, right? They get engaged, all right, we're going to do voting rights, we're going to do civil rights, we're going to do this. Many people don't just get in and say, listen, I'm reaching for the stars and we're going to deal with nuclear arms, right? So, I mean, where does this come from in your life to say, listen, this is my passion, this is what I want to do, we're going to tackle this, this is what I want to do?
No, you are right. Most people do not dive headfirst and go, yes, I want to get big. I'm a fundamental piece of the security structure of the world. And I'm not going to lie to you. I leaped into this moment. But you're going to be shocked about my answer. The place where I really was reinvigorated to work on nuclear weapons was during the Black Lives Matter movement. And I recognized that there was a real relationship between policing and militarization, and the ultimate colonizer was nuclear weapons. And I saw that there was a lack of communication with my own community, a lack of understanding, and an erasure of what had been a strong past of Black and civil rights involvement in the nuclear abolition cause. I saw people like the current Undersecretary of Arms Control and Nonproliferation, Bonnie Jenkins, who was a Black woman, doing this work, and I was inspired. And so every time I step into this threshold and every time I am able to bring the issues that I care about, whether that be the proximate threats of racial justice or voting rights or economics, into this fora, I recognize that safety and security is more than just the weaponry we put forward. It is more than just when we have conversations about policing. And I want my own community to benefit from an equitable world where they feel safe in all facets. And so that's why I do this work. That's why I bring my voice. That's why I believe in this nuanced perspective, because I'm hoping that the next generation after me won't have to do this. But if they do, they saw somebody that looked like them, who was fighting for them, and they will continue that cause.
When you talk about that, that brings me to my next question, which is like, okay, that's you, right? You're trying to get another generation of people in there. It's not necessarily the first thing that somebody's going to think about. Or when we talk about activism and awareness, right? I just did a section about clean water. You're talking about poverty. You're talking about that. They're like, I can get on the boat for that, right? How do you get people on the boat to say, listen, we need to talk about these nuclear weapons out there. You got people talking about guns on the streets, right? So now you're talking about guns and nuclear weapons in the world. So how do you get somebody involved? How do you attack a young, or you really, introduce to a young person, somebody that's not of your generation, to say, this is something that you can be active in. And not only this is something that you can be active in, and I mean this with all sincerity, because you're literally making a difference in it. How do you get somebody to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that is the thing that I'm thinking about every day. And there's a level of resilience in doing this work. And what I would say is, first of all, don't leave that movement that you're working on. We need people doing clean water. We need people working on voting rights and racial justice and all of these other guns, all of these other incredibly important things that you've mentioned. But this is a generation, and we know this, that understands the importance of doing a multiplicity of things. We've seen Gen Zs, I'm a millennial, we love a good multitask moment. We love a moment where we can intersect our causes. That's what I'm asking for. I'm acknowledging that when I'm doing my work on nuclear weapons, I'm also doing work for racial justice, and people can do the exact same thing. So when I invite them in, I first humble myself and I listen. What is your most pressing issue? What is the thing that you are working on right now that you feel like if this is not solved immediately, we are in crisis? And then I think and I tend to come back to you on how the nuclear issue intersects. I can do that with public health. We can talk about generational health traumas and crises and the potential for a pandemic worse than COVID-19 based on the threat of use of a nuclear weapon. I can do that with climate change. We can talk about the ways that the military are impacting climate change or what it would look like to have a nuclear winter or even just the current generational and ecological impacts of nuclear testing and mining. We can talk about racial justice and where money is being siphoned from our communities, or the ways in which policing and militarization are so deeply intertwined, or even just the basic levels of how we used to be engaged in this issue because we saw it as an act of civil rights. There is no monolithic answer for how you get an individual engaged, and I think that's what good activism is. It's tapping into different bases, have different conversations, and meeting people where they are. The more that you see them, the more likely they are to be engaged in your issue. And that is what's worked for me thus far. That's how I've helped Global Zero and how we are building a movement that looks different than those of the past. More diverse, more inclusive, and more easily engaged. And I'm not going to lie to you, it doesn't help that there is a potential threat for an ongoing war. People are a little bit more wanting to be there because they can actually feel the proximate threat at this moment. But otherwise, it really is meeting them where they are, and that's creating good activism.
We can continue this conversation forever because it is. I mean, I think that when you have the threat looming, that there's going to be
Yeah.
more people who are going to be, okay, what can I do? Right? It's the hot topic. What do I do? But the reality is, the real work goes when the threat isn't looming, when
Exactly.
there isn't the rumor of war,
100%.
when we're not watching, those other networks, right, that have
Yeah.
the front and center of what's before us every day. Russia, Ukraine. It's real work when the cameras are off, and it's real work when
100%.
nobody's paying attention, and that is when you really see who's down for it. And so I gotta say, Mari, I know you're
100%.
down for it. Thank you.
A minute.
Appreciate you. Before we go, somebody wants to get in touch with you, Global Zero, how do they go about doing that?
They can go to the Global Zero website. All of the petitions that I've mentioned are on there, whether that's getting back to arms control, intersectional, joining our movement. You can find me on Twitter at Diaspora Diva. I am very active. Feel free to message me. I love to engage in conversation or reach out. We have emails on there about our partnerships and engagement. You will get an answer from somebody, and I am always willing to have the conversation. Thank you so much for fostering this moment.
Hey, thank you very much for being with us and sharing this moment. All right.